going to delve into this magic box where some questions have been sent to me. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. I'm old, late boomer generation, right? So my generation, when we were at school, we were basically taught histories that were very state-centric, elite-centric, and what have you. And histories were very much national histories rather than regional histories or global histories or transnational histories or whatever. I think when I began my work, I started, my original domain, my academic production was really in the domain of political history, right? My doctoral thesis was about the evolution of Malay Muslim political thought. My early works were on religio-political movements and the history of religio-political parties in Southeast Asia. So I suppose there are many books, there's several books that come to mind, and these books remain for me very important books that helped me find my own voice and helped me develop my own style of writing. Now, I suppose two books come to mind. One would be Simon Sharma's Citizens, a chronicle of the French Revolution, which for me is a magnificent book. It's huge, it's a huge book, and it chronicles the French Revolution that many people are aware of. But I think to sum it up, it's a book certainly worth reading, but to sum it up, what Simon Sharma really shows in this book is that the French Revolution was not one revolution, it was actually many revolutions taking place all at the same time. It was an economic revolution, it was a gender revolution, it was an administrative revolution, it was an ideological revolution, it was a scientific, religio-cultural revolution. All of these things were happening at the same time. Now, the reason why that book was so important to me was that it taught me two things. One, it shows in a very clear way that historical progression is never linear. There's always this tendency in history, because we tend to assume that time moves in a linear manner, right? Like a straight road. And what the book shows, actually, Simon Sharma's book shows, is that actually history doesn't move in a straight line. History is like a landscape, it's open. And there are all kinds of historical currents happening at the same time. While this is happening, another thing is happening, they impact on one another, they overlap, they may crisscross, they may contradict one another. And I think that was very important for me because it changed the way I understood temporality, time itself, right? That we should not see time in linear terms. Another book that had an enormous impact on my own work later on would be Zlatan Tedorov's book, The Conquest of America, which I think is an extraordinary book because, like me, Todorov's background is in philosophy and philosophy of language. So while he wrote about the conquest of America, and there are many books about the conquest of America, his book is different because it's not a chronicle of names and dates, right? But rather he looked at the idea of America itself, and he makes a very important observation, which is that the most dangerous and the most insidious forms of violence is not necessarily physical violence, not necessarily killing, conquest, battles, but something that we don't see, but something that actually shapes and informs how we see. And that is what he calls nominal violence, which is the violence of naming. He makes this point very early on in the book. The very act of naming this continent, America, was actually the first act of violence. Now, that has had an enormous impact on how I look at history, because my focus has always been the 19th century colonial Southeast Asia. And if you're familiar with my writings, then a lot of my work is about how Southeast Asia was discursively constructed through not only the workings of capital, but also through the workings of language, yeah, and how the invention of the idea of Southeast Asia is a demonstration of force. It is a demonstration of force because the powerful can define you. The powerful define the weak. The powerful name the weak. The powerful map the weak. And I think these two books by Simon Sharma and Svetlana Todorov, I think were important. I can also name a few other books that I think have really influenced me as well. Mudimbe's book, The Idea of Africa, it's a fantastic book that is actually very similar to my own concerns about Southeast Asia, but Mudimbe looks at how Africa was also ideologically, discursively constructed. There's Ellis's book, The Social History of the Machine Gun, which I think is a fun book, very instructive, and a very good book if you want to see how to write material history. There's another book by another Ellis, Founding Brothers, which is about the foundation of the United States and how at the beginning, at the genesis of what we now call the United States of America, there was actually a lot of ambiguity as to what the country should be. Yeah. So again, when people look back at history, you have the idea that America was always, already fully defined, fully constituted, and it knew what it was going to be. But actually, that's not true. What Ellis shows in the book is that there were so many debates, even the naming of America, even the choice of what would be the national language for the United States. All these things were debated, and it is only with hindsight, as Ellis notes, it is only with hindsight that we have the impression of a solid history. History is not solid, it's not solid. And here it almost brings us into the domain of quantum physics, where a lot of these processes are indeterminate. They are not necessarily determined from the outset. The intention might not reach the desired results. And so that's why history is such a fascinating subject. But it becomes fascinating when we stop looking at just institutions and we start looking at personalities and subjective human agency, and how human agency creates these things and plays a central role in the process of what we call history. It's always been a timely question. Okay, I am on the one hand deeply pessimistic. I'm deeply pessimistic. But at the same time, strangely, I'm also deeply optimistic. So maybe I'm actually schizophrenic, right? But I'm optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. Let's put this question in context. I think today, living as we do in the age of doom scrolling and bad news and fake news and conspiracy theories, there's always this tendency for us to think that the world is about to come to an end. But if you go back in history, people have been saying the world is coming to an end all the way back to the Roman Empire, until now. We're still here, right? So I don't think the world ever ends. But the pessimism that we see around us, I think, is the result of not only historical processes, but also other processes that have basically helped to frame and shape our worldview. Now, if you read the news today or watch the news, whether on TV or on your handphone, then you'll be bombarded by nothing but bad news. But that has been a steady, process that goes back to the beginnings of modern popular culture and the printing press and the visual press and the audio press. And that's because the news is never really news. We ought to know this by now. We ought to know this by now. So how does a historian deal with this? Well, there are several ways. One, I remind myself of the fact that no matter what crisis has befallen the human species as a whole, human beings have extraordinary tenacity and capacity to not only survive, but to think their ways through it. The key thing is, again, this is the philosopher of language speaking, right? What's the vocabulary that we ought to use? If you say that this is a disaster, this is a disaster, this is a disaster, this is a catastrophe. Now, the very use of these terms, catastrophizes the situation, and those in the domain of psychology and psychoanalysis will be familiar with this. So if we continue to paint everything in catastrophic terms, then they are catastrophic. They become catastrophic. I'm not denying the reality that there is a lot of injustice in the world today, and we see this all the time. We just watch what's happening to the people of Palestine. I mean, that is an objective reality, but how we view that reality and how we deal with reality requires us to expand our vocabularies further. I think we need, like I said, I'm generally pessimistic, but I maintain my optimism because I still believe that even in the worst of times, the capacity of human beings to redeem themselves is always there. And there are plenty of historical examples, And I suppose when you think of it in terms of the longue durée, long term, humanity as a whole, I think, can still endure. There are many historical figures that come to mind. One would be, the very, very renowned and famous and important scholar, Ibn Khaldun, whose work, Muqaddimah, was perhaps one of the first, if not the first, examples of what we now call political sociology. Now, if you know Ibn Khaldun's life, the poor man was vilified and persecuted many times. He lost so much. He was demoted, removed from his post. He lost his family. He suffered so much throughout his life. But hundreds of years later, his works endure. People remember Ibn Khaldun for his amazing contribution, to what we call political sociology, because he was one of the first who placed human agency at the center of history. Do we remember, all these powerful people who persecuted him, who vilified him, who humiliated him? No, we don't. We don't remember any of them. They're all gone. But we remember Ibn Khaldun. So in that sense, I suppose, from an academic's point of view, one hopes that one's ideas endure despite what happens. Now, the scholar of literature in me would say that literature also provides, us with maybe not material examples, but hypothetical examples. My students, during the time of COVID, and I'm constantly surrounded by 20-year-olds, because that's the age group of my students, the 20-year-olds. And I think it was very tough on my students during COVID, because they're still young human beings, and already in their late teens and early 20s, they're told, their lives are over, they can't go out, they can't do this, they can't do that. And I think my students went through a very, very difficult period during COVID. And I told them, while you're at home, instead of doom scrolling all the time or wasting your time playing video games, why don't you actually read a book? And one book that comes to mind is Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. And War and Peace, people might ask you, what's the relevance of War and Peace today? Well, read the book first. Read the book first. In broad terms, it's set during the time when Russia is invaded by the armies of Napoleon. But what's interesting about the book is that it's actually a book that has many characters, and the three primary characters are Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, Natasha Rostov, and Pierre Bezukhov. And in the novel, they are young people. All three of them are very young. Natasha is still a teen, and they have all these hopes and dreams and ambitions, hopeful for the future. And then this catastrophe arrives with Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Their country is destroyed, invaded, they lose everything. All their hopes and dreams, all their ideals are shattered. Pierre Bezukhov, at the beginning of the novel, is an admirer of Napoleon. But then when Napoleon invades his country, his hero becomes an anti-hero. All of them go through these deep personal crises. But as a result of this crisis, they grow and they mature and they learn the really important things in life. They learn the value of understanding, wisdom, patience, humility, and above all, love and forgiveness. So we live in desperate times. There's no denying it. Apart from the political conflicts that we see, I'm deeply worried about what is happening to our societies as a result of AI, these new technologies that are for the first time, poised to replace human beings in many vital sectors. Entire careers are now, on the verge of extinction. And so we are facing really difficult challenges before us. But as individuals, like Andrei Bolkonsky, Natasha Rostov, Pierre Bezukhov in the novel, each of us has to find the strength within us to first understand what's happening around us, and two, to realize that no matter what happens, your humanity is your responsibility. Your capacity to love, your capacity to believe, your capacity to have faith, these things will only disappear if you relinquish them. And that's what the characters learn in the novel. So give it a read, I mean, it is, a wonderful novel, an important novel, but I think that's how, go back to the question, how do I stay hopeful amidst tumultuous times? I stay hopeful because every single day, no matter how bad the news is, no matter how catastrophic the world seems on the news, on your phone, every single day I see acts of human kindness. When I see someone feed a cat by the road, when I see someone help someone across the street, when I see people doing the most mundane things, the most mundane acts of human valor and heroism. I mean, real heroes don't look like these stupid Marvel superheroes. Real heroes are the ones who stay the course, the ones who control their temper, the ones who help even when they need help themselves. I mean, I encounter that all the time, and that keeps my faith in humanity alive, because I still think humanity is something worth preserving and fighting for. And as I come close to my own retirement, I think the last struggle I have now, as IT and ChatGPT and AI, overwhelm all of us, is I want to remain a human academic and a humane academic. For me, this is the thing we must preserve the most in education, from lower education, secondary education, higher education. Education is a human process, and I want to see, I will try my best to humanize education as much as I can, as long as this heart is still beating and this brain is still working.